Dyatlov Pass is a very famous story about these hikers that go missing in the 1950s. They were hiking into the Ural Mountains to take this thing called their Level 3 hiking test.
On a freezing February night in 1959, 9 hikers vanished in the remote Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia. When rescuers finally located their camp, what they uncovered sparked one of the most chilling mysteries of the 20th century. A tent slashed open from the inside, belongings untouched, and bodies scattered across the snow, some half-dressed, others with injuries so severe they defied explanation. For decades, theories have swirled, from military experiments to UFOs. But now, AI has finally solved the mystery, and it's far worse than we thought. Stay tuned as we unravel the strange and unsettling story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. The expedition. In January 1959, a group of students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on a journey that was supposed to earn them the highest certification in Soviet mountaineering. To qualify for this Category 3 certification, they had to complete a trek of at least 300 kilometers in extremely harsh conditions. The man chosen to lead them was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student known for his discipline, leadership, and remarkable ability to plan every detail. The group consisted of 9 others: Zina Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Krivonishenko, Nikolai Thibault Brignolet, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Yuri Yudin. They were young, intelligent, and adventurous, between 20 and 38 years old, and all experienced hikers. They were not reckless amateurs. Each one had successfully completed demanding treks before. Their friends and families later described them as people who thrived in the wilderness, who actually welcomed the bitter cold of the Russian winter as part of the challenge. The plan was ambitious but achievable. They would ski out from the small settlement of Vizhai, move through the Ural peaks, and reach Mount Otorten, a mountain whose name in the local Mansi language ominously translates to "don't go there." For Dyatlov and his companions, that name was more folklore than warning. These were the years when the Soviet Union celebrated endurance, strength, and scientific progress. A successful expedition was as much about national pride as personal accomplishment. On January 25th, the team boarded a train heading north. They sang songs, played mandolins, and wrote in their journals, often poking fun at one another. Many of these diaries would later be recovered, preserving the eerie normality of the days before disaster. By January 27th, they had reached the last inhabited settlement. There they stocked up on food, left behind some supplies they wouldn't need, and prepared for the most difficult stretch, the uninhabited wilderness of the Ural Mountains. It was here that fate intervened. One of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, began suffering from sciatica and severe knee pain. Reluctantly, he turned back, leaving the group of 9 to continue. Yudin's decision would later save his life, and for decades, he carried the heavy burden of survivor's guilt. He often said he wished he had stayed with his friends. The remaining 9 pressed on. In their diaries, they described cheerful evenings, hot meals, and friendly arguments about who was the better skier. They also faced biting winds, plunging temperatures, and relentless snow. Yet nothing in their writings hinted at fear or foreboding. They were confident, almost casual, about the dangers ahead. On January 31st, they reached a river valley and began to climb toward a mountain pass that would later bear Dyatlov's name. They cached extra supplies in the valley below, planning to collect them on their return. The next day, February 1st, proved crucial. Their route took them off course, steering them toward the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, another peak named by the Mansi, meaning Mountain of the Dead. Bad weather rolled in, visibility dropped, and the group found themselves disoriented on a treeless slope. Dyatlov made a critical decision. Instead of turning back to the forest for shelter, he chose to pitch their tent high on the slope itself, cutting into the snowpack to create a flat surface. To seasoned mountaineers, this was not reckless. It was a calculated move. Camping on the exposed slope meant they would not lose progress, and Dyatlov's leadership was rarely questioned. His companions trusted him. They spent the evening eating a final hot meal, making light-hearted notes in their journals, and snapping photographs of each other bundled against the storm. That night, the 9 hikers lay down inside their canvas tent, unaware that they would never see the sunrise. Within hours, something drove them to tear their way out into the howling cold, abandoning boots, coats, and even essential gear. Whatever happened on that mountainside would remain hidden for weeks until rescuers stumbled upon the scene. When the Dyatlov group failed to send word from their journey by February 12th, no one panicked at first. Delays were common in Soviet expeditions, but as days passed, the families of the hikers grew restless. Their parents pressed for answers, and soon the Ural Polytechnical Institute organized a search party. At first, fellow students and teachers volunteered. When nothing was found, the search grew, drawing in soldiers, helicopters, and local Mansi hunters familiar with the unforgiving landscape. On February 26th, rescuers stumbled upon something strange high on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. At first glance, the tent looked ordinary, half buried under snow, tilted at an odd angle. But as they cleared the drift, they realized it hadn't collapsed naturally. The canvas had been slashed open from the inside. Snow poured through gaping rips, covering blankets, boots, and clothing. The hikers' gear was still neatly arranged, as though they had fled suddenly and never returned. For seasoned rescuers, it was baffling. Why would 9 experienced hikers in sub-zero temperatures cut their way out of a tent instead of unzipping the entrance? And why would they abandon coats, felt boots, and food supplies that were right there within reach? The searchers followed footprints leading away from the camp. At least 8 or 9 distinct tracks were visible, preserved in the snow. But these were not the prints of fully dressed, prepared mountaineers. They showed bare feet, socks, and even a single shoe. The trail descended toward a forest about a mile downhill, then faded into drifts. The first 2 bodies were found at the forest edge, beneath a large cedar tree. They were identified as Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both dressed only in their underwear. Their hands were raw and bloody, as if they had torn at the tree bark in desperation. Nearby, the remains of a small fire smoldered in the snow, an attempt at survival that hadn't lasted long. Between the cedar tree and the tent, 3 more bodies were found. Dyatlov himself, Zina Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin each appeared to have collapsed at different points along the route, as though they had been trying to crawl or stagger back uphill to their camp. Dyatlov was face up in the snow, clutching branches. Zina's body was found farther up, her fists clenched. Slobodin's skull showed a minor fracture, but investigators concluded he likely fell repeatedly before succumbing to the cold. 5 hikers were accounted for, but 4 were still missing. The search dragged on for weeks. Then, in early May, thawing snow revealed their bodies in a ravine deeper into the forest, sheltered in a shallow den dug out of the hillside. These last 4, Dubinina, Kolevatov, Zolotaryov, and Thibaut Brignol, told an even more chilling story. They were dressed more warmly than the others, wearing pieces of clothing taken from their fallen companions, but their injuries were severe. Thibaut Brignol had a fractured skull. Zolotaryov's chest was crushed with such force that investigators compared it to the shock of a car accident. Dubinina's ribs were broken, and disturbingly, her tongue and parts of her face were missing. Kolevatov showed fewer injuries, but had no chance of survival in the freezing conditions. Perhaps most unsettling was the nature of the wounds. Despite catastrophic internal injuries, there were few external marks, no cuts or bruises consistent with an attack or a fall. The medical examiner admitted he couldn't explain how such damage was possible. Adding to the mystery, some of their clothing showed traces of radiation, though later reports suggested this could have come from materials they had been exposed to in their studies or workplaces. By spring, all 9 bodies had been recovered, yet the questions only multiplied. Why did trained mountaineers abandon shelter without proper clothing? Why did some die of hypothermia, while others suffered massive internal trauma. And what could account for the missing tongue and eyes? The discovery shook the Soviet public. Families wanted answers, but official statements were brief and unsatisfying. In May 1959, the case was quietly closed with a vague explanation. The hikers had died due to a compelling natural force. Files were archived, restricted from public view, and whispers began that the government was hiding something. The official investigation only deepened the intrigue. The question now lies in what were the findings of the investigation? What anomaly was found? The investigation. The official investigation began as soon as the first bodies were recovered. Rescuers had already been unsettled by the oddities of the campsite. The tent cut open from the inside, footwear and coats abandoned, and personal items laid out as though the group had left in a hurry. For Soviet investigators, these were not just strange details, they were clues that defied common sense. Autopsies revealed 5 hikers had succumbed to hypothermia, but 4 bore massive trauma. Zolotaryov and Dubinina had multiple rib fractures, while Thibaut Brignol's skull was crushed with such force that doctors compared it to the impact of a speeding car. Kolevatov's injuries were less catastrophic, but still had a fractured skull and soft tissue damage. Yet there were no external wounds that should have accompanied such damage. No bruises, no cuts, no signs of a beating. Dubinina's body in particular baffled examiners. Her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, and even some facial tissue were missing. Officially, these injuries were blamed on natural decomposition and scavenging animals, but to grieving families and curious outsiders, they looked sinister. Several of the bodies had burns on their hands and legs, as if they had come into contact with fire. Though only a small campfire was found nearby, others showed odd skin discoloration, a kind of deep orange-brown tan that friends and relatives swore they did not have in life. The most unsettling detail: traces of radioactive isotopes were detected on the clothing of 2 victims. How could radiation appear in the snowbound wilderness of the Urals? The hikers had kept detailed journals, along with several cameras. Their last diary entries were normal, filled with light-hearted jokes, plans for the route ahead, and even a playful note about snowmen in the mountains, which later fed into Yeti theories. The final photographs captured moments of their trek, the group smiling despite worsening weather. The last frames, however, were stranger. Blurry images taken at night, possibly of bright lights in the sky. To this day, some interpret them as evidence of fireballs or secret weapons tests, though others argue they were simply overexposed shots in difficult conditions. The search party noted that the footprints leading from the tent were clearly visible, preserved in the snow. They were left by people walking calmly, not running. Some prints were from bare feet, others from socks or a single shoe. This calm exodus puzzled everyone. Why would 9 experienced hikers abandon their only shelter in sub-zero temperatures without proper clothing or a sign of panic? It suggested they had been compelled to leave the tent quickly but not chaotically, as if something or someone forced them out. Local Mansi hunters were interviewed. They denied harming the hikers and insisted the mountains were dangerous but not haunted. Some villagers reported seeing glowing orbs in the sky around the time of the tragedy, feeding the theory of secret military tests. Families of the dead pressed investigators with questions about the unusual injuries and the strange orange hue of the skin. They were met with silence or vague reassurances. By May 1959, after weeks of confusing evidence and mounting public interest, the case was abruptly closed. The official conclusion: the hikers died due to an unknown, compelling natural force. The phrase was deliberately ambiguous, a bureaucratic way of admitting ignorance without provoking political trouble. With that, the files were stamped and locked away. For the families, this explanation was no explanation at all. For the wider public, it was fuel for rumor. Why were the files classified? Why was radiation mentioned but never explained? Why had 9 young people died in circumstances that sounded like the plot of a horror story. The investigation may have ended, but the mystery of Dyatlov Pass had only just begun. Almost immediately after the first 5 bodies were found, rumors swirled that the Dyatlov hikers had witnessed something otherworldly. Many derived different theories to explain the anomaly. Theories over the decades. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become less of a mystery and more of a mirror, reflecting back the fears, obsessions, and unanswered questions of every generation that has tried to solve it. Since 1959, countless theories have been put forward, each promising to make sense of the eerie details: the torn tent, the barefoot footprints, the crushed ribs and fractured skulls, the missing eyes and tongue. What really drove 9 young hikers into the frozen night? For decades, no single explanation seemed to fit. Instead, the Dyatlov mystery gave rise to an entire catalog of possibilities. One of the earliest theories to catch fire was that the hikers had encountered something not of this earth. Several villagers from settlements near the Ural Mountains later testified they saw strange glowing spheres moving slowly across the night sky during the same week the Dyatlov group went missing. These lights were described as orange or reddish, too large to be flares, too slow to be meteors, and lasting far longer than an aircraft beacon. When rescuers developed film from one of the hikers' cameras, a handful of photographs showed blurry streaks of light cutting across the dark sky. For many, this was damning evidence. The group had witnessed a UFO, tried to document it, and paid the price. The official investigation made note of the glowing orb reports but never pursued them. To skeptics, that silence looked like a cover-up. From there, the UFO hypothesis took on a life of its own. In the fevered imagination of Cold War Russia, where secrecy was the norm and strange phenomena were often explained away, it was easy to picture the hikers stumbling across an extraterrestrial craft or weapons test gone wrong. Supporters pointed to the strange orange discoloration of some bodies, the missing tongue and eyes of Lyudmila Dubinina, and the fact that the hikers cut their way out of their own tent as signs that something terrifying and inexplicable had forced them to flee. Paranormal explanations extended beyond UFOs. Ball lightning, a rare but real atmospheric event, was floated as a natural cause of the glowing orbs. If a plasma sphere had appeared near the tent, it could have terrified the hikers and sent them running. Still, ball lightning usually dissipates quickly and rarely leaves lasting physical effects. It didn't explain the traumatic injuries. Then came the Yeti theory. A Soviet newspaper, hungry for sensational headlines, ran a piece calling the deaths the abominable snowman's work. Some claimed blurry photographs in the hikers' collection showed a shadowy humanoid figure on the ridgeline. Was a giant creature stalking them? The idea captured imaginations, but investigators found no claw marks, no tracks, no signs of a struggle. The Yeti theory remained a tabloid invention rather than a credible explanation. Even so, paranormal theories refused to die. They provided an easy narrative: mysterious lights, strange injuries, Soviet secrecy. In an era when trust in official accounts was low, the supernatural seemed almost more believable than the mundane. If not aliens, then perhaps the culprits were human. Another school of thought suggested the Dyatlov hikers became unwitting casualties of Soviet military testing. The Ural Mountains, remote and sparsely populated, were often used for secret experiments. One theory involves parachute mines, explosives dropped from planes that detonate just above the ground. Such blasts can cause massive internal trauma without leaving obvious external wounds. This eerily matches the autopsy results of hikers like Zolotaryov and Thibaut Brignol, whose ribs and skulls were crushed as though they'd been in a car accident, yet their skin showed no external injuries. The burns on Dubinina and Kolevatov could also have come from the heat of a blast. Another angle points to radiation. Investigators recorded elevated radiation levels on some of the hikers' clothing, and later reports indicated that a few garments glowed under ultraviolet light. While it's true that two of the hikers had previously worked at nuclear facilities and may have carried contaminated clothing, conspiracy theorists argue this was too convenient. To them, it suggested the hikers had stumbled into a radiation-related test, perhaps of a nuclear-powered weapon, and were silenced. Supporting the military hypothesis is the strange behavior of the investigation itself. After the bodies were found, the case was quickly closed. Files were sealed. Witnesses were told not to discuss details. Officially, the deaths were ruled the result of an unknown compelling force, a phrase so vague it only deepened suspicion. Why would Soviet authorities leave the case so open-ended unless they had something to hide? Some even suggest the hikers were mistaken for spies or were accidentally killed during military maneuvers, and the government buried the truth. In a Cold War climate defined by paranoia, it was not hard to imagine 9 ordinary students becoming collateral damage in the machinery of secrecy. While UFOs and military cover-ups fueled the imagination, later researchers sought explanations rooted in the natural environment of the Urals. One idea focused on katabatic winds, sudden, powerful downdrafts that can sweep down mountain slopes at terrifying speeds. Such winds have been recorded in polar regions, capable of flattening tents and killing explorers. If a katabatic surge hit the Dyatlov campsite, the hikers may have had only seconds to react, slicing their way out of the tent to escape suffocation or collapse. A related theory involves infrasound low-frequency vibrations produced when wind passes over a mountain. Though inaudible, infrasound has been shown to cause dizziness, nausea, and overwhelming feelings of dread. A study suggested the hikers, bombarded with infrasound generated by the dome-shaped peak of Kholat Syakhl, might have been overcome by panic, fleeing into the night without their boots or coats. These environmental theories have the advantage of explaining the seemingly irrational behavior. Why experienced mountaineers would abandon their shelter in lethal conditions. They also align with known meteorological phenomena. Yet, they struggle to account for the devastating injuries found on some of the hikers. A strong wind may cause disorientation, but it does not crush rib cages or fracture skulls. In the earliest days of the investigation, suspicion briefly fell on the Mansi, the indigenous people who lived and hunted in the area. Could the hikers have trespassed on sacred land, provoking violence? The theory was quickly dismissed. The Mansi were among the first to join the search and expressed sorrow over the tragedy. No evidence of human attack, no defensive wounds, no weapon marks was found. Still, the possibility of human conflict lingered in the imagination of some who sought a culprit. The idea of an animal attack was also considered. Bears and wolves roamed the Urals, but rescuers found no tracks around the tent or bodies. The cuts on the tent came from the inside, not slashes or bites. The missing tongue and eyes of Dubinina, often sensationalized, were almost certainly the result of natural decomposition and scavenging by small animals after death, not evidence of a brutal assault. What made the Dyatlov Pass incident so haunting was not just the deaths, but the vacuum of answers. Every strange detail, glowing orbs, radiation traces, internal injuries, missing body parts, seemed to demand explanation, and in the absence of clear evidence, theories filled the void. For decades, researchers, journalists, and armchair sleuths proposed one scenario after another, none fully satisfying, each leaving gaps that another theory would try to fill. If these theories couldn't explain it, what then is the perfect explanation for this incident? The final theory, slab avalanche. Theory. For 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass tragedy sat suspended between folklore and cold case files. Every decade seemed to bring new theories, from UFOs and secret weapons to yetis and curses, but none ever fully explained the facts. Then, in 2019, the Russian government reopened the investigation, and in 2020, after extensive research, officials announced their conclusion. The hikers had died because of a slab avalanche. At first, this answer disappointed many. An avalanche felt too ordinary, too anticlimactic after decades of paranormal and conspiratorial intrigue. But behind that single word lay a far more complex and convincing scenario, one that finally reconciled the case's strangest details with the harsh, indifferent logic of nature. Unlike the towering, thundering avalanches that dominate disaster movies, a slab avalanche is subtle, often silent. It occurs when a compact layer of snow, held in place on a slope, suddenly fractures and slides downslope in a single piece. Imagine a pane of glass shattering. The snowpack breaks apart along an invisible weak layer, releasing an immense weight all at once. For mountaineers, slab avalanches are among the deadliest dangers because they give little warning and can occur even on relatively gentle slopes. The Dyatlov hikers, camped on the side of Kholat Syakhl, had unknowingly set up their tent in precisely the wrong spot. This was their theory, that on February 1st, 1959, Dyatlov's group pitched their tent on an exposed slope just below the crest of the mountain. It was an odd choice. Most hikers would have camped lower down, in the protection of the forest. But Dyatlov, determined to practice for their final ascent, wanted the challenge of a mountainside camp. To create a flat space, they carved into the slope, disturbing the snowpack. Combined with a layer of weak snow buried deeper beneath, this action set the stage for disaster. At the time, there was no sign of danger. The slope was only around 30 degrees, considered marginal for avalanches. The group prepared dinner, laughed, and took photographs as the wind howled outside. What they could not know was that their camp had become a ticking time bomb. For decades, skeptics of the avalanche theory pointed out that rescuers saw no evidence of an avalanche when they arrived weeks later. The tent was still partially standing, the snow not deeply buried. How could an avalanche have swept through without leaving obvious scars? In 2019, researchers at ETH Zurich, a leading institute in Switzerland, re-examined the case using advanced snow mechanics models. Their conclusion was startling. The Dyatlov hikers had likely been the victims of a delayed slab avalanche. At ETH Zurich, one of Europe's leading science institutes, researchers were intrigued by the case. Two scientists, Johann Gaum and Alexander Puzrin, believed physics might provide the missing link. They ran simulations of snow dynamics, trying to see if a small block of snow, a slab, could explain what happened that night. Their challenge was showing how such a modest avalanche could inflict skull fractures and crushed ribs without burying the hikers in tons of snow. To do this, they borrowed technology from an unlikely source: Disney's animation team. While working on the film Frozen, Disney scientists had developed some of the most realistic snow simulation software ever created. ETH Zurich obtained access to that code and adapted it for serious scientific modeling. With these tools, they recreated the conditions on Kholat Syakhl slopes in February 1959. Here's how it worked. The hikers cutting into the slope weakened the snowpack. During the night, wind piled additional snow above the tent, increasing the load. Hours later, without warning, a large slab detached and crashed directly onto the tent. Because it was a localized slab, not a massive slide, it left little evidence after the fact. Over the following weeks, fresh snowfall and wind erased the signs. By the time rescuers arrived, the slope looked deceptively calm. The slab came down with crushing force, pinning the tent. Several hikers may have been injured immediately, sustaining the rib fractures and skull trauma later recorded in autopsies. For the others, the priority was escape. Trapped under a collapsed tent in freezing darkness, they cut their way out with knives. But the situation was dire. With part of the group injured and their shelter compromised, they faced an agonizing choice: stay put and risk another collapse, or retreat downslope to the forest for cover. In the chaos, they chose the latter. Some fled without shoes or coats, desperate to save themselves and their friends. The footprints leading down the slope, calm, deliberate, suggest they were not running in blind panic. Instead, they were trying to regroup, hoping to build a fire and wait out the night. In the trees below, they managed to light a small campfire. Branches were stripped, some even broken several meters high, likely as they climbed in desperation to gather wood. But the temperatures plummeted to -30°C. Those who had fled barefoot and half-dressed stood no chance. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, closest to the fire, were the first to succumb to hypothermia. The others tried to improvise, cutting clothing from the dead to stay alive. 3 of the hikers, including Dyatlov himself, attempted to crawl back upslope to the tent, but collapsed in the snow before they could reach it. The remaining 4, Dubinina, Thibault, Brignol, Kolevatov, and Zolotaryov, pressed deeper into a ravine, seeking shelter. There, the weakened snowpack betrayed them again. A second collapse buried them beneath meters of heavy snow. The immense pressure crushed ribs, fractured skulls, and left them fatally trapped. The slab avalanche theory, unlike others, ties together nearly every piece of physical evidence. Crushed bones but little external injury, consistent with the blunt force of a snow slab pressing bodies against hard ground. Tent cut from inside, exactly what survivors would do if their shelter collapsed under snow. Lack of avalanche traces, explained by the small, localized slab and weeks of wind and snowfall covering signs. Radiation on clothing, a red herring, easily traced to hikers who had handled radioactive materials at their workplaces. Missing tongue and eyes, common effects of post-mortem scavenging and decomposition in running water. Even the glowing orbs reported by villagers can be explained. Soviet missile tests were indeed taking place in the region during that period, producing strange lights in the sky. It was coincidence, not causation. If the avalanche theory is so compelling, why did it take 60 years to reach consensus? The answer lies partly in human psychology. From the beginning, investigators used vague language, unknown compelling force, that invited wild speculation. Witnesses were silenced, files sealed, rumors left unchecked. Into that vacuum, extraordinary theories thrived. An avalanche, by contrast, felt too ordinary. People resist simple explanations for bizarre events. We want mysteries to stay mysterious. And in the Soviet era, with its culture of secrecy and paranoia, official denial only fueled the sense of conspiracy. But science is patient. Over time, as each fantastical theory fell short, the avalanche hypothesis quietly gained strength, until the weight of evidence was impossible to ignore. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and click on the next video shown on your screen.